Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me. I'm Dr. Heather McCauley. I am a social epidemiologist and assistant professor in the School of Social Work at Michigan State University. I'm a sexual violence prevention researcher, and today I'm here to share a little bit about my team's research on hashtag activism and the Me2 movement. As you can tell by the title, a content warning, I will be discussing sexual violence in this presentation. So if you got to this presentation today, you might be aware of what Twitter is, but for those who aren't or who are less familiar with how Twitter works, Twitter is an online social networking service that enables users to send and read short 280-character messages called tweets. It was founded in 2006, and it currently has more than 326 million monthly active users. So it's a common platform for those of us to get our news. For example, when I turn off my Twitter and I need to focus on grant writing, for example, I find that I don't even know where to get my news anymore. And so it is certainly an active place and a place for us to connect to each other across the country. And a hashtag, which is the focus of today's presentation, a hashtag, these were first used in 2007, and they're a type of label or metadata tag used on social networks which makes it easier for users to find messages with a specific theme or content. So you could type a word with a hashtag in front of the word, and then anyone who's ever done that on their own posts, you'll see a kind of a list of those posts, and you can follow conversations. Those of you who are familiar with hashtags might laugh at my spelling out of hashtag here, but that's for those of us who are used to calling hashtags pound signs. And in the world of Twitter, they have been used more and more as forms and platforms for activism. So what is hashtag activism? It's a use of hashtags as a way for a group of individuals, in particular groups of marginalized individuals, to come together in discursive protest on social media through some sort of united word, phrase, or sentence. Now, I can't find updated statistics, but there's a 2016 Chicago Tribune article which highlights some of the most tweeted social justice hashtags. So again, these data are a couple of years old, but I think they help illustrate, and you might remember some of the social justice movements related to these hashtags, like Yes All Women, Bring Back Our Girls, Ice Bucket Challenge for ALS, Black Lives Matter, which continues today, Love Wins, When Doma Fell, and Ferguson. And we see here, this is an image from the Pew Research Center, which highlights how what's happening in the news and what's happening in real life. Then you see trends of hashtags on Twitter. So this is an example of Black Lives Matter, and then the response, All Lives Matter. And you'll see here, although if you look at the graph all the way to the left, it's when in 2013, when Black Lives Matter first appeared on Twitter. And then it was kind of quiet between 2013 and 2014 when Eric Garner was murdered in New York City. Then Michael Brown was murdered, Tamir Rice, et cetera, et cetera. And you see the blue line from left to right, and that represents the number of tweets, number of times that Black Lives Matter was tweeted over time. The line below was the response, All Lives Matter, which you can see was tweeted significantly less than Black Lives Matter. So this was a platform for those in the movement to rally against the murdering of Black men in our society. And you'll see how that those trended over time. Every time this happened again, and we were talking about this again, we saw this upsurge in social media activity and conversations in protest. The same could be said for the use of hashtags in response to sexual violence that has been so pervasive in our society. And we call this hashtag feminism. So for example, in July of 2014, photos spread through social media of a high school student, Jada, after her alleged sexual assault. Twitter users mocked her pose, calling it Jada pose. And so feminists responded with a variety of hashtags in support of her to challenge this violence that was happening on social media platforms. And my work, and I came to analyze hashtag activism after I read this paper by Dr. Jacqueline Cravens Pickens, who's at Texas Tech. This is a really brilliant paper, and one that I send all of my students to, especially because it does such a nice job outlining her methods for how she analyzed social media data. So this particular paper analyzed the trending hashtag why I stayed or why I left in response to this dominant narrative, or that question that survivors get, why didn't you just leave? And so this is a really powerful paper that looks at those. And I should point out that I'm not actually going to spend much time on the findings, the content of the findings in each of the papers that I'll present. This is really an opportunity for me to share with you the methods, because those are the questions that I get asked most frequently. I get emails from all over the country asking about how to do this kind of analysis. So that's what I'll focus on today. So Dr. Cravens analyzed 409 tweets joined by the hashtag why I stayed, 267 why I left. And she used nCapture, an in vivo software attachment, which you can download. I go to Google Chrome and I was able to download nCapture. And she used content analysis for subjective interpretation of the content of text data through the systematic classification process of coding and identifying themes or patterns. So her team used a very systematic procedure for reading each tweet and identifying the general themes that emerge from the data. And again, I send all of my students to this paper because the author does such a nice job outlining the methods step by step and addressing really important information that we think about in qualitative data collection, like trustworthiness, and all of that is outlined in this paper. So my team wanted to try it out as well. So there was a hashtag, maybe he doesn't hit you, which was initiated in May 2016 by a Dominican writer and activist, Zahira Kelly. And she used it as an opportunity to talk about the realities of abuse, including highlighting non-physical forms of intimate partner violence. Because in the media and in dominant narratives, we hear most about physical forms of violence. And so this hashtag was intended to allow survivors to share the various forms of psychological aggression, reproductive coercion, and other forms of violence that they were experiencing in their relationships. So in our data, we used nCapture. Again, which basically allows you open up your Twitter page, you initiate the software attachment, and then you are able to collect publicly available data from Twitter's API. Now, so if someone has their account protected, then we're not able to collect those data. And we collected data for this first study for 1 week. And we did that because we wanted to capture social media behavior both on the weekend and during the weekday, thinking that that would allow us to, because each of us, we have our own schedules, and that would allow us to collect a broader swath of the population of Twitter users engaging in these conversations. So we collected more than 14,000 tweets for analysis after excluding non-English language tweets and excluding retweets. So you can either have an original content tweet where it's kind of your own original comment, and then your followers can retweet it. So we got rid of retweets, we got rid of ads, and we got rid of non-English language tweets. When we got those 14,000 original content tweets, there was just no way that our team could reasonably analyze the data. It takes longer than you think to analyze tweets. And from a content saturation perspective, we learned pretty quickly that it just wasn't necessary to analyze all 14,000 tweets. We hit content saturation at about 2,500 tweets. In this case, we read all of the data. There are kind of two approaches you could use to coding the data. You could either start from scratch and allow those themes to be identified. You can go in with no preconceived notions about what you think you're going to find. Or you can come in with existing frameworks, kind of a predetermined approach for doing the work, introducing these sensitizing concepts. And so for us, we read the data set, and it became pretty clear to those of us doing this work that the conversations really aligned, or what survivors were sharing was really aligned with existing frameworks in the field. So both the power and control wheel and the women's experience of battering framework. So we then used those frameworks to create our coding scheme for the data set. This is an example of some of the tweets that users shared. So you'll see here, so for example, and again, for those of you who want to press mute or pause and skip over this, please do so. So maybe he doesn't hit you, but you know it's only a matter of time. Or maybe he doesn't hit you, but he yells, shoves, waves fists, tries to intimidate. If looks could kill, you'd have died 1,000 deaths already. Maybe he doesn't hit you because not all abusers are men. Maybe he doesn't hit you is the dumbest hashtag I've ever seen. I love this hashtag. There are so many ways someone can be abused besides getting hit. Emotional is equal to physical. So you can see here that in addition to, and we found many of the tweets aligned with those existing frameworks, people sharing multiple forms of power and control in their intimate relationships, and multiple responses in response to that, in response to those abusive behaviors, like managing your behavior to minimize the violence that was happening in your relationship. We also saw, though, challenging, and this is something you do when you do Twitter analysis, you check to see if there are tweets that just don't align with those main themes. And so we had users challenging the gender orientation of the hashtag, recognizing that violence happens in relationships of all genders. We also had sentiments, people were challenging the hashtag, saying that it wasn't necessary, and saying that people were just making up these stories. And so in our paper, we talk about that backlash to hashtag feminism. And that's something that we see in the media. You know, we hear those stories minimizing abuse on a day-to-day basis. So those certainly weren't surprising, but it was really powerful here when you are reading through these tweets to see that those sentiments so visibly present in these analyses too. Then came the 2016 election, and I was watching the one of the debates, and I got a text from my colleague, Dr. Megan Moss. She's an assistant professor in human development and family studies at Michigan State. And this was right after the Access Hollywood tapes were released, when now President Trump, then candidate Trump, talked about sexually assaulting women. And so Megan texted me right after that happened, and said, collect data now, because a tweet or a hashtag had started trending, not okay, which was an opportunity for survivors to share their first experiences of sexual assault. So the next day I went into the office, and we were able to collect data and do analyses of these data. So as I mentioned, this hashtag trended after Access Hollywood tapes were released during the presidential election. And we captured tweets between October 9th and October 11th, yielding more than 8,000 original content tweets. And that was because we collected data for 3 days right after this happened, so that we could make the case that these data reflected commentary related to those tapes specifically, and not the debates more generally. There were a couple really important findings in this paper. There was an acknowledgement and condemnation of rape culture. There was also considerable conversations about what it felt like and what it meant to have people, leaders at the highest levels of power, use sexual violence against people. And then there was a call to engagement and voice to end violence against women. And you'll see in the next paper that I share that was something we were able to unpack in subsequent Twitter conversations. During this time, the Me2 movement was unfolding. First, really at the beginning, September and October of 2017, when Alyssa Milano repopularized this Me2 sentiment, originally founded by anti-violence activist Tarana Burke. But it started trending again in October. And then with Alyssa Milano, and then Harvey Weinstein and the allegations against him starting to unfold. December 6th of that year, Time magazine names Me2 activists as Persons of the Year, and this continues. You'll see again spikes with Les Moonves resigning from CBS, with Brett Kavanaugh and the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. So you'll see, and Me Too has really dominated our conversations ever since. In response to that, an Australian activist responded and said that it was men's turns to step up to the plate and initiated a hashtag #HowIWillChange. My fabulous graduate student, Morgan Pettyjohn, who is a couple and family therapist and doctoral candidate in human development and family studies at Michigan State, initiated this paper and worked closely with doctoral student Finn Muzzy to conduct these analyses. And so Morgan collected 18,000 publicly available tweets from Twitter's API on October 26, 2017. She eliminated non-English language tweets, any retweets, and news articles or advertisements, yielding over 3,000 original content tweets. We used a similar process. We used qualitative content analysis. We downloaded the tweets into InVivo and used a really systematic procedure where Morgan and Finn coded 10% of the data set and then another 10% of the data set. And each time we met together to finalize the code book and then allowed them to code the rest of the data set. And they found a couple of really critical pieces of information. And huge thanks to our reviewers on this. This was published at Psychology of Men and Masculinity. And our reviewers really helped us with the organization of these data, highlighting that Twitter users in this trending conversation fell into 3 categories. So these were men who were committed to actively engaging in dismantling rape culture, men who were indignantly resistant to social change, and those who were promoting hostile resistance to social change. And that hostile resistance we also saw with the Maybe He Doesn't Hit You hashtag. There are a couple limitations of Twitter analyses that we think about in all of our work. One, it's certainly not generalizable to the general population. Twitter users trend younger and more college educated than the general population. And we're not able to collect demographic information about users. So there are a couple key pieces we can collect using NCapture. We are able to collect the user-defined profile, so the words, any words that they choose to describe themselves. We are able to collect that information. We collect the content of the tweet. We're actually able to collect the latitude and longitude of the tweet, which I'll talk about in a minute. But we're not able to formally collect demographic information about the users. So we really can just talk about, in terms of external validity and generalizability, talk about the profile of Twitter users more broadly. It's also, using NCapture, difficult to capture back and forth exchanges. So we couldn't really analyze some sort of conversation that would be happening on Twitter related to these trending hashtags. It was really just capturing comments that were made at one point in time and then looking at themes across those. There's also questions about echo chambers. And based on the Twitter algorithms, the social media algorithms that exist, are we just communicating with people who think like us anyway? So are we just having these conversations amongst ourselves? There's certainly that argument that could be made. But in particular with Morgan's How I Will Change paper, we really saw this backlash, this kind of people participating in all levels of the conversation, from really supportive to really hostile. And so I think, to me, that is evidence that the echo chambers might not be as narrow as we think. There are a couple of questions that, if we were face-to-face, I would love to dig into with you. So one I always get is, do conversations online shape real-life behavior? So some people say, who cares that these conversations are happening on Twitter? What does that matter about our day-to-day lives? And I have a couple responses to that. Dr. Moss is an expert in online and offline behavior and the intersections of those. And my own team has done work on cyber dating abuse, for example, and found that those who experience those kinds of behaviors online are also more likely to experience those kinds of behaviors in their real life relationships. And so I think that is an argument that there is a blending of this online and in-person space. I also think online behavior can be really powerful because there's evidence that narrative communication shapes social norms. And so in these spaces, Twitter and these conversations online certainly shape what conversations are normal, normalizing rape culture, some of the victim blaming beliefs that we hear and are familiar with in our research, we see them play out in social media as well. And so I think these kinds of conversations are really powerfully positioned to challenge those normative beliefs. I think it's also a really important space for those survivors who haven't disclosed to anyone yet. So they might not be participating in the conversations. They might not have told anyone that that's what they experienced, but just watching these things play out on Twitter, there is evidence that they found a lot of comfort in those conversations. So in the maybe He Doesn't Hit You trending conversation, saw a lot of people saying, wow, I wish someone would have told me that emotional abuse was a form of violence. I just didn't know, and it would have saved me a lot of pain. And this is the most important conversation. Thank you. I don't feel so alone anymore. And so I think there's something to be said about these spaces and how they're creating community amongst survivors, because for so long, sexual violence was considered this private issue that people weren't allowed to talk about. And so it's been really powerful to read the data and read these conversations online and see how these conversations are playing out. There's also really interesting debates and conversations about doing this kind of analyses. So public tweets, using nCapture, collecting Twitter data in this way. I collected public tweets. We did analysis of public tweets, and they're considered public conversation. And so I would be interested in having a conversation with this audience about how you feel about that. Some of my students say, well, when you're engaging in these conversations, you're putting it out there for anyone to read, so they don't see a problem with it. Others say feel a little less comfortable with their public conversations, these kinds of tweets being analyzed in this way. So I'd love to have a conversation with you about that. I do want to say that for the purposes of my studies, I have removed, I mentioned you could actually capture the latitude and longitude of tweets. I've actually removed those data points from my data set. I haven't used them. I did help on a different paper about depression, where one of our doctoral students at Michigan State analyzed data regarding depression and did a really interesting map of the latitude and longitude of tweets related to depression. So I think there are a lot of really interesting ways that you can use mapping, GIS mapping, for example, if you have research questions where you think geography would be really important. But for these papers, I did remove those kinds of data from my data set. And with that, again, I didn't want to go too in-depth into any of the papers, but I have a lot of interest and a lot of questions from those interested in doing this kind of research. So I wanted to share how you do it with nCapture. There are also other forms of data collection where you can use Python and algorithms to collect data and do different kinds of quantitative analyses with those data sets. Certainly are exciting as well. And I look forward to learning more from those of you who are doing those work as well. Thank you very much, and stay safe.